Welcome everyone, and thank you for taking the time to join tonight's webinar, Top 10 Tips for the Updated AP Statistics Exam, presented by leading stats authors and teachers, Daren Starnes, Josh Tabor, and Luke Wilcox. I'm your host. My name is Thomas Mena, and I'm the STEM Marketing Manager here at BFW High School Publishers. The bulk of the webinar will be the presentation itself, followed by a Q&A. We hope to wrap things up around 7 p.m. Eastern Time. The Q&A may push us over a bit, but if you have a hard stop at 7 p.m., don't worry. You will be sent a full recording so you can catch any last few questions and answers. There are many attendees, so everyone is muted and will be muted throughout the webinar. We will send a follow-up to this webinar with its recording, along with the slides and an extended Q&A document for any questions we don't get to later on. The follow-up will also include clear instructions on how you can easily share this recording with your students. Please allow for a couple days for us to send this follow-up to the webinar, and we'll do our best to get it out by Friday or Monday. If you don't have a follow-up email after Monday, be sure to check your spam folders. For questions, and this is very important for the Q&A section of the webinar, you should see a chat function on the GoToWebinar toolbar down below. In this chat function, you can write and send your question. It should already be the default, but if you have it as an option, choose Send Question to Staff. When you send in your question, questions chatted in will get sent to me, and I'll read them out loud for our presenters to answer during the Q&A section. And in some cases, I can even chat the answer back if I know it in real time. Feel free to send in questions at any time during the webinar. Since there are many attendees, it is possible we might not get to all of the questions. If we don't get to your question, don't worry. We'll do our best to address anything that goes unanswered in our follow-up via an extended Q&A document that can be downloaded along with the slides. Also, feel free to send any unanswered questions directly to hsmarketing@bfwpub.com. Or if you're watching the webinar as a recording and have questions then, you can send them to that email as well. For sales-related questions, such as what are the digital options for the practice of statistics, feel free to contact your sales rep directly. If you're unsure who your rep is, visit go.bfwpub.com/findmyrep. Your rep is a resource for you, and they're always happy to talk about our books and share information, whether you're a current user or not. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our presenters this evening, who many of you in the stats community, I'm sure, are already familiar with. Along with being the author team for the #1 AP Statistics program, The Practice of Statistics, Daren, Josh, and Luke have such impressive backgrounds, I wanted to highlight a little bit about each. Daren Starnes is Mathematics Department Chair and holds the Robert S. and Christina Sykes Dow Distinguished Master Teacher Chair in Mathematics at the Lawrenceville School near Princeton, New Jersey. A frequent speaker at national conferences, Daren has led countless AP Stats Institutes for both new and experienced teachers, and has been a reader, table leader, and question leader for the AP Stats exam since 1998. Josh Tabor has enjoyed teaching on-level stats and AP Stats to high school students for more than 23 years. Each year, like Daren, Josh leads AP Summer Institutes and College Board workshops around the world and frequently speaks at conferences. In 2011, he was a top 5 finalist for Arizona Teacher of the Year. He has been a reader, table leader, and question leader for the AP Stats exam since 1999 and was a past member of the AP Stats Development Committee, as well as in 2013 named to the SAT Mathematics Development Committee. He is the co-author of 2 popular on-level stats books, Statistics and Probability with Applications, which he co-wrote with Daren, and the much-loved Statistical Reasoning in Sports series. And finally, Luke Wilcox, who you may recognize if you watched any of the College Board's AP Statistics online classes and review sessions this year, is a longtime reader and workshop leader and teaches Intro Stats and AP Stats at East Kentwood High School in West Michigan. Notably, Luke was the 2017 to 2018 Michigan Teacher of the Year and was previously recognized as the Presidential Award winner for mathematics. He is the author of the Teacher's Edition for the Practice of Statistics 6th edition, both classic and updated, and has worked on a number of our leading books and programs. Luke believes that students and teachers learn best when there's a context to connect their learning. That's why he and his colleague, Lindsay Gallus, founded the Statsmedic, an awesome site dedicated to statistics education. Be sure to visit statsmedic.com as well as follow them on Twitter. Now, let me be the first to say thank you to our presenters for their time tonight, as well as their time spent researching and preparing this webinar for us. And without further ado, I'll pass the screen to Luke and we'll get things started. So Luke, I'm making you the presenter. And we should be good to go.
Okay, excellent. Can you see my screen now?
Sure can.
Excellent. All right. Well, hello to everybody, and I'm going to take the first couple of tips here for the 2020 AP Statistics exam. And I would like to say first that all 10 of the tips that we're going to give you today are excellent tips in preparation for the AP Stats exam for any of the years, but we are going to go into a little bit more detail specifically about some tips that might be different this year for the 2020 exam due to the reformatting of the 2020 AP Stats exam. So let's go ahead and jump right in with AP exam tip number 10, which is you got to talk the talk. So what we mean here is that you have to be very specific in the language that you use when you're writing up your solutions to your free response questions. Any misuse of a term could result in a deduction. So the way the rubrics are written for the AP exam, if you misuse a term, it could take you from an E, essentially correct, down to a P, partially correct, or from a P, partially correct, down to an I for incorrect. So based on reading AP exams for several years now, there are some terms that we see quite often that students use or maybe misuse too loosely here, because these terms have very specific statistical meanings. So confounding, biased, and skewed are very often used by students as a synonym for bad. These terms are good statistical terms to use, but you have to be using them in the right context. Okay, confounding variable is something that makes it difficult to tell whether an explanatory variable is causing changes in a response variable. When we say biased, we're typically referring to a sampling method which consistently overestimates or underestimates the truth. And when we're using the term skewed, we're most often referring to the shape of a distribution for a quantitative variable. Now, another example that shows up very specifically in a couple of rubrics is the idea of blocking versus stratified. Now, in both cases, you're taking some big whole group and splitting it up into groups where within the groups, the individuals are similar. But you have to be very clear that when you are dealing with an experimental design, you would be used blocking, whereas if you're doing some sort of sampling procedure, you would be stratified sampling. So you have to make sure that you're using the correct term based on the context. Similarly, the idea of a distribution being normal versus approximately normal, this has shown up specifically in rubrics where most often you're going to want to say that something is approximately normal. So when we check the large counts condition or the large sample condition, that allows us to say that the sampling distribution is approximately normal. You don't want to say exactly normal in that case. That could cause your score to go down. Now, not only is your language important, but also the symbols that you use when you write up your solutions. So your notation has to be correct. So misuse of symbols will often result in a mandatory deduction. So this happens most often when students are showing some of their work. Maybe they're calculating a confidence interval and they show the formula. You got to make sure that you're using the correct symbols in your work. So if you're referring to the proportion for the whole population, you use P, whereas a sample proportion is P hat. And similarly, a population mean is mu, whereas a sample mean is X bar. So here's our advice. First of all, you just got to know your stuff. You got to know the vocabulary terms and you got to know the notation. You got to know the difference between a statistic and a parameter. Next, only use terms and symbols that you know. It's better to explain in your own words than to use a term or symbol incorrectly. So maybe if you forgot the term stratified sampling, you could just instead describe a sampling method where you would take the whole population, split it into groups, where within each group people are similar, without actually using the term. Or maybe instead of using the incorrect notation, you could just say sample proportion instead of P hat. And then this one is extremely important, shows up on rubrics all the time. You want to make sure that when you're writing up your answers to a free response question, that you're including context in your responses. So you don't want to say something like the distribution of data, or the distribution of values. Instead, you might say something like the distribution of prices for one-bedroom apartments. So make sure you include that context. Okay, let's move on to AP exam tip number 9, prepare your workspace. And this is one that is going to be specifically different for the 2020 AP exam because this is going to be an at-home AP exam rather than one that you would take at school. So here's a couple of things to think about. First of all, you want to make sure that you have the formula sheet and tables there ready and available during the exam. And a special note here that the formula sheet is brand new for 2020, so make sure you're not printing out the old version. One quick way to check that you have the correct formula sheet is that in the new one, you'll see formulas for the mean and the standard deviation of a geometric distribution, which those two formulas were not available on the previous version. Next up is to make sure you have your calculator charged and ready. Now, the calculator may not be required for the exam this year, but most certainly it can probably be a help to you and a benefit. So you just want to have it ready and all charged up, ready to go. And then this is an important one. You want to make sure that the place where you're going to take the AP exam, you do some studying ahead of time in that room. There's actually plenty of research which suggests that if you study some material in the same context where you'll be taking an exam on that material, that you actually retain the information better. So you most certainly don't want to be in that room for the first time on the AP exam day. Now, number 8, manage your time, is also going to look a little bit different for this year's AP exam because of the different format. And this one is going to be extremely, extremely important for this year. The 2020 AP Stats exam is going to be 1 full year's worth of learning boiled down to 2 free response questions. Question 1 will be 25 minutes, worth 55% of the exam. And then you will have 5 minutes to upload your answer for question number 1. Once you upload your answer from question 1, question 2 becomes available, which you'll have 15 minutes to work on, and then an upload time of 5 minutes. Now, once you submit that answer for question number 1 and move on to question number 2, you will not be allowed to go back and work on question number 1. So here's a couple of tips. First here, make sure that you don't spend too much time on an individual part of a question. Okay, most definitely each one of these 2 questions is going to be multiple parts. Probably 5 or 6 parts for question 1 and probably 4 or 5 parts for question number 2. So you're going to have about 3 to 5 minutes on each part within the question. So you want to make sure that you're not spending something like 10 minutes working on one part of one of the questions. Next up, don't get too stressed if you feel uncertain or confused about one part or another. It turns out that you'll probably still be able to get even a 5 on the AP exam, even if you didn't write anything down for one of the parts. So don't let that hang in your head. Move on to the next part and just be confident. And then the last tip here, if you can, you don't want to leave anything blank. There's no penalty for guessing on things, and you can get partial credit for partial answer. So even if you just have some sort of random guess at it, put that guess down on the paper before you move on to the next part. So that takes us through AP exam tips number 10, 9, and 8. I am now going to pass it over to Josh, who's going to take you through the next couple tips here.
All right. Well, thank you, Luke. Let's see if I can get this going here, showing my screen. And everybody's looking at tip number 7, is that right?
Yep. That's right, Josh.
Okay, good. Everybody else was muted. All right, so number 7 is practice with your technology. This particular tip is really special for this year. First, you want to make sure, whoops, what just happened there? Sorry.
I think there might be animations on the slide.
Yeah, I'm just trying to, oh, there we go. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry about all the technical difficulties here. You want to use the computer or your phone for uploading or downloading your test exam. So the delivery of this year's exam is obviously quite different than previous years. So I'm going to put a link at the bottom of this particular slide that's going to reveal some information that the College Board presented to help students and teachers feel a whole lot more comfortable with this year's format. Second tip here is that you must use the same device for accessing questions and then uploading your answers. So what we're talking about here is students would often, I think, be inclined in a statistics class to write out their answers by hand with a paper and pencil, and then take a picture of that and upload it. So on the webinar that we watched last night with Trevor Packer from the College Board, they suggested that there's 3 ways that you could perhaps manage this process. One way would be to use a laptop or a desktop to access the questions, and then type your answers in a Word document or a Google Doc, and copy and paste those answers and submit them through the same laptop or desktop that you access the questions from. Another way that you could do this is, again, with a desktop or a laptop to view the questions. Write up your answers in a Google Doc or a Word doc, and then save it as a file, like a PDF or a Word doc, and then upload that file. Now, if you want to write it out by hand, their suggested method was to use your phone to download the questions or access the questions, then write out your answers on a piece of paper, take a picture, and then upload your answers from your phone. It is possible that you can access the questions on a computer, write it out by hand, take a picture of your answers with your phone, but then you have to send that picture from your phone to your computer because you have to use the same device to upload your answer as the device you're using to access the questions. So there's going to be opportunities for students to practice. College Board has said May 4th is the magic day for when they'll have opportunities for students to practice this process. And again, I'll give you a link in just a second with more details. The third thing is related to what I was just saying, which is getting familiar with the testing platform. Obviously, this year is going to be very different, and I think students and teachers are nervous about it. But the College Board is committed to making this a smooth process, and the best way to make it a smooth process is to practice. Again, there'll be an opportunity for students to do that starting on May 4th. So you want to be paying attention to My AP and AP Classroom for that information. They've also said in the webinar last night that if students do have technical difficulties during the exam, maybe they lose power or they get disconnected from the internet or something like that, that those students will be able to take the makeup exam the first week of June. They were specific in saying that running out of time and not uploading your answer in time is not a reason for a retake. But other types of technical difficulties, they will allow you to do the retest in June, which is one reason why they strongly encourage every student to take the test in May so that they have a backup in June if there were to be some sorts of problems. And now here's the link that I was referring to earlier. This is going to be really helpful. It's a long document with a lot of great information. So as a teacher, I would want to read through this, make sure you understand all of it, and maybe condense it a little bit and maybe share some highlights with your students. So practice with your technology, tip number 7. All right, tip number 6 is know your inference. So you want to practice identifying the appropriate inference method for a given setting. Larry Green has a great applet, which I'll quickly link to, as well as we have a TPS handout in the teacher's resource materials. So one of the things that might be different this year on the AP exam is the fact that students are allowed to use their notes, their books, their previous assessments. They're allowed to use the internet. They're allowed to use all kinds of resources. Now, that may not be a very good use of time, but another implication of that is that the questions are going to be written so that you can't just look up the answer. So I could see very easily a question that says, you know, here's a scenario, describes an experiment or a sampling procedure, and ask the students to identify what procedure would be appropriate, because that's not something they could look up in their notes or look up on the internet, because it's going to be based on whatever specific context they're given on the exam. So spend lots of time practicing identifying inference procedures. Here's what Larry Green's applet looks like. You'll load it up, and it says click the categories that you want to work on, and then hit the submit button. So start by selecting all, and then you want to deselect a few of them. The prediction interval for a single value of y for a fixed x, that's not something that's covered in AP Stats. And then you want to uncheck all the 3 chi-square tests, as well as one-way ANOVA. That should leave you 10 inference procedures, including 1 and 2 proportions, 1 and 2 means, and match pairs for means, both intervals and tests. So this would be great. And then you hit submit, and it just gives you examples of scenarios, and then it gives you the choices. And if you choose something incorrectly, it'll give you hints about how to get the correct answer. And there's hundreds of these scenarios. So have your students practice identifying the correct inference procedure. Another tip, make sure you can manage each component in the 4-step inference process. So I don't know how likely it is that you're going to get a 4-step process where you have to write out the state and the plan and the do and the conclude, considering that they have only 2 questions to test you over the whole year's worth of material. But it's certainly possible that they could ask you to check the conditions, or state some hypotheses, or make a conclusion, or interpret a confidence interval in context. So it's unclear whether you'll have to do the 4-step process from scratch, but it's almost a guarantee that you're going to have to do at least some parts of that process somewhere in the 2 questions on this year's AP exam. Here's a reminder of what those 4 steps are, both for confidence intervals and significance tests. If you use the practice of statistics, these 4 steps, the state, plan, do, conclude, should be very familiar to you by now. All right, tip number 5, the naked answer means no credit. Here's the directions that you'll see at the beginning of every AP exam. It says, show all your work. Indicate clearly the methods you use, because you'll be graded on the, hold on, I'm gonna move my screen for a second. Okay, on the correctness of your methods, as well as on the accuracy and completeness of your results and explanations. This is going back all the way to the very beginnings of the AP exam. Every answer requires some sort of justification or explanation or work. If it's something that's a calculation, say a probability question, just saying the probability is 0.23 might get you partial credit if it's correct, and it might get you no credit at all. You need to show some work, some linkage from the numbers that you're given in the problem to the answer that you get on the final answer that you get. Even if it's something as simple as adding 0.1 plus 0.13 from a table, you need to write out 0.1 plus 0.13 equals 0.23, so you can get credit for showing your work. Remember, naked answer, no credit. And finally, tip number 4, focus on statistical thinking. This is, of course, great advice for any AP statistics exam, any year that you're thinking about taking it, but it's especially important this year. The first tip says, be prepared to go beyond fill-in-the-blank interpretations. Now, this is a speculation that we have, that because students are allowed to use their book and allowed to use their notes, it's unlikely that there's going to be lots of opportunities to sort of do one of the fill-in-the-blank interpretations. There might be some, like interpreting a confidence interval or the slope of a least squares line, but it's unlikely that there's going to be lots of those opportunities. So it's important that you know what you're talking about, that you understand the statistical thinking involved, and you're not just filling in blanks. It's unlikely you're going to have lots of opportunities for that on this year's AP exam. Now, practice applying concepts, skills, and definitions in context. Luke mentioned this already as always answer in context. I want to re-emphasize that in this particular point, that answering in context often means just using the variable names. So if you're describing a scatter plot, you want to talk about a relationship between the x variable, whatever that is, and the y variable, whatever that is, and you want to name those variables. Same thing if you're describing a distribution or comparing a distribution, or describing an experiment or a sampling plan, talk about the variable names. That's a great way to earn credit for context. Okay. Think about how and why things work the way they do. That, I think, is going to be a big part of this year's exam. Oftentimes, students are asked to check the conditions. Well, now that they're given their notes in their book, it's not too hard to remember what conditions are appropriate for a particular test. So they might go a little bit deeper and ask, well, why do we check this condition? Why do we check the large counts condition? Or why do we check the normal or large sample condition? Or why things work the way they do? It's unlikely that there's going to be a lot of heavy duty probability calculation because they've told us that you should be able to do all the calculations with a paper and pencil. So it's possible that there might be a question about sampling distributions, where the question might say something like, explain why it would be appropriate to use a normal distribution in this context. And then you have to know, oh, well, maybe it's because you have a normal population, or maybe because you have a large sample size. The point here is make sure you understand why you're doing the things you're doing and what justifies their use. Finally, don't worry about calculator techniques this year. So if you're watching this for the 2020 exam, like I just said, they only require that you have a paper and pencil for doing calculations. And as Luke mentioned, I imagine it would be comforting to have your calculator with you, but I wouldn't worry too much about some of the more in-depth kinds of things that you could do on your calculator. It's more likely that you're going to be using it for dividing two fractions or multiplying by a percentage, if even that. So I wouldn't spend as much time as you might in other years worrying about calculator techniques. Instead, focus on statistical thinking. All right, so that's the end of tip 4. And now I'm going to pass this on to Daren.
Thanks, Josh. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep, we can see it.
Great. So I get the top 3 tips, starting with tip number 3. And this is a tip that would apply in any year, but maybe especially this year where we know there are only going to be 2 questions, each with multiple parts, as Luke mentioned, and that is, don't write too much. You've heard the old saying that less is more, but truly, on the AP Statistics exam, when you're writing out a solution, a better approach is to answer the question in context, using the variable or variables of interest, and then shut up. Smiley face there in case you don't like shut up. It really is not helpful sometimes if students just keep writing and writing, because eventually they may write something that falls afoul of the mandatory deduction rule. They might use a term incorrectly, or they may commit a flagrant foul of notation. Another tip along these lines is to avoid writing 2 different solutions or approaches to answer the same question. As readers, we're trained to, when we get parallel solutions, just grade the weaker of those 2 parallel solutions. So for example, on an inference question that might be part of this year's exam, students might be asked to state hypotheses. Well, if the students can't decide between hypotheses involving a population mean mu, or a 2-sample test, or hypotheses for a paired t-test, they might be tempted to hedge their bets and write both sets of hypotheses down. Bad strategy. We're going to have to look at that as parallel solutions, and the students will be graded on the one that is the weaker one, the one that's wrong. Another piece of advice from experience, students find it pretty hard to interpret p-values as conditional probabilities or confidence levels as the long-run capture rate of a method that's used to create the confidence intervals. So we would recommend in any year that you, as students, not interpret the p-value or confidence level unless you're asked to. Now this year is a little interesting because we don't expect a sort of textbook interpretation of a p-value or fill-in-the-blank interpretation of a confidence level, because students have access to textbook notes, prior assessments, and to internet search. This is an interesting one. All 3 of us have been graders for a number of years, and we've seen students argue with the question writers. That is, in their response, they'll say something like, well, I don't really know how you could have taken a random sample of butterflies in this forest. Fascinating to know that. You may be right, but it's really not going to get you anywhere to make arguments with the question writers. Or if the question writer tells you that the conditions are met for a particular procedure, don't then proceed to try to check all those conditions. You may find that you don't have enough information in the problem to do so. All right, moving on. Tip number 2. This one is a very important one. RTQ and ATQ. And I'll bet everybody knows what they stand for. It's very important that a student read the question carefully. Most of the deductions I've seen on student papers are because the student didn't adequately read the question that was asked or did not answer the question that was asked. Maybe they answered a question they would have preferred be asked, but that isn't the one that's being scored. So in particular case, if a question asks you to do one of these things, we'll remind you to make sure what you do. If a question asks you to describe a distribution of a quantitative variable, students should know by this point, you look at shape, outliers or other unusual features like clusters or gaps, center, and a measure of spread or variability. Some people use the acronym SOX for that. If a question asks you to compare distributions, if it's of quantitative data, you want to be sure that you explicitly compare the centers of those distributions, which one's bigger or smaller, or are they about equal, and explicitly compare the spread or variability of those distributions. Again, which one's got more or less, or about the same spread or variability. If the question asks you to describe similarities and differences, be sure you do both of them. Many students, when they see a compound instruction on the exam, will only do the first half. And so that's a pretty good guarantee for earning only partial credit. If a question asks you to explain or to justify, make sure you do that. You can't just give the answer with no explanation or justification and expect full credit. If a question asks you to choose between alternatives or options, it's really important that you make a choice and that you then justify why you chose the one you did and why you didn't choose the one that you didn't. That's showing clearly that you understand why one is the correct choice and the other one is a less than correct or less optimal choice. And if a question asks you to do more than one thing, that compound instruction, identify and interpret the slope. Don't just identify it. Or state and check conditions. Don't just state them. And certainly don't just put a check mark. Check conditions means verify conditions. And the number one tip this year, be prepared, the old Boy Scout motto, and be confident. At least 95% say. Take advantage of the wealth of exam review and preparation resources that are out there, including a few of these. In the practice of statistics, we have cumulative AP practice tests, numbers 1, 2, and 3. That covers through all of the material on this year's exam through the end of test 3. Test 4 would include chi-squared and also inference about slope, which are not covered this year. So any of those 3 cumulative AP practice tests will review important content. As was mentioned earlier, Luke has been involved with the AP classes and review on YouTube Live. And if you haven't checked any of those out yet, you really should. I enjoyed listening in, sorry about that, on 1 or 2 of them early on. So you can easily click and go here for the online AP classes and review sessions. And those will be continuing. In fact, Luke may want to tell you more about that in a moment. You might also, if you haven't yet, take advantage of the Stats Medic exam review course. I can promote Luke's very high quality site, the Stats Medic, and also the excellent review course that he and Lindsay Gallus have developed. The AP Classroom Question Bank has been opened up so that students can practice the types of free response questions, I'll put a caveat there, that they will see this year. Now, to be fair, those questions were not newly created for this year. They were taken from a prior exam, and the spirit of those questions and the parts of those questions was in the right spirit of most of this year's exam. The exception is there weren't the limitations on calculations with paper and pencil being all that was needed in the past. So some of those parts of questions might involve calculations or use of calculator menu item that really wouldn't be appropriate this year. But they are available for practice. They have a little green target in the AP classroom so that you can identify them. And they do cover the types of thinking that would be required on this year's exam. So be sure to take a look at those. Also, Khan Academy has some very fine AP statistics practice questions, and one of those is another identify the correct inference procedure of the sort that Josh showed you at Larry Green's website. And perhaps the most important piece of advice to help you be prepared and be confident is to strategize by identifying the weak spots, the question types or content areas that you feel most nervous about seeing questions concerning on the exam, and then really dial in now, from now until May 22nd, and focus on fixing them. Make them stronger. If your luck is anything like mine was in school, the thing that I dreaded most was almost certain to come up. So there's no point hiding from your weak spots. Continue to work on your strengths so that if a question comes up in that area, that builds your confidence and also helps your score. But if you can identify those weak spots and remedy them, strengthen them up to a level where you'll be able to at least get partial credit on part of a question, that will really help you. All right, so a quick recap, and then we'll open up for some questions and answers. Tip number 10, you got to talk the talk. Number 9, special for this year, prepare your workspace. And as Luke mentioned, go ahead and do some work in the workspace prior to the exam so that you can attach those memories of your work to that space and hopefully recall them when you need them on the exam. Number 8, manage your time, especially important this year where the countdown timer will be showing on the screen, and you'll know when you're down to the 5 minutes left for uploading on each of the 2 questions. Number 7, again, especially important this year to practice with your technology. This time we mean the technology you're going to use to access the exam and the technology you're going to use to capture your response to submit for the exam. Tip number 6, know your inference. And as Josh mentioned, that doesn't necessarily mean you'll see a full construct and interpret a confidence interval problem this year or a full carry out a significance test problem, but you're very likely to see some of the skills that are required within the 4-step process, the whys as well as the hows. Number 5, if you give a naked answer with no explanation, you should expect no credit. Anything more than that is just generosity on the part of the rubric. Number 4, as we're coming down the home stretch, focus on statistical thinking, not just how to do things, but what the underlying idea is behind what you're doing. You can rest assured that the question writers have been creative in trying to figure out how to assess what you've learned, and they do want to see things that you've learned, as well as to identify any of those weak spots. Number 3, don't write too much. You'll fall afoul of that mandatory deduction rule. Number 2, read the question and answer the question. That'll save tremendous agony when you look back at the responses that you gave later and realize that you didn't actually answer the thing they asked. And tip number 1, be prepared and be confident. Tommy, I think we'll kick it back your way.
All right, and if you go to the final slide there.
Yes. Almost had it.
Almost had it. Yeah, if you could just leave that final slide up, we can get going. So we did definitely, I just want to say thank you again to everyone who is on the line and attended tonight. We got a number of questions in during the webinar. And if you have a question that you haven't chatted in and you still have it, you can do so by just writing it in the chat and then choosing send question to staff and then sending it in. I do want to say a general reminder that we will shortly, either the end of this week or very early next week, we'll be sending an email that will have a recording of this webinar as well as the slide deck and a question and answer document, which is where basically if we can't get to all the questions that were chatted in, we'll then put them in a document and provide a written answer for them. Seems that Daren, I think you have a, there we go. Sorry about that. So you will be sent that shortly, so just stay tuned for that. And we'll also provide clear instructions on how you can share the recording with your students. For sales questions, if you have any kind of sales questions, you can definitely contact your sales rep. If you don't know who that is, there's the link where you can find out who your rep is. I'm gonna go ahead and put my my screen up real quick. Give me 1 second.
That's an excellent idea.
Yeah. And so keep chatting those questions in. And for the team, a lot of the questions are very similar, so I'll try to pick out the best ones that kind of cover the most questions at once. So let me present from current slide. Okay.
While you're doing that, Tommy, I had one thing I wanted to add.
Yes, please.
About the preparing the workspace tip. I don't know if I heard this on the webinar last night or it came to me as I was planning this webinar today, and that is to not only study in the workspace that you're going to be taking the exam in, but try to do it at the same time of day, because the garbage truck might be coming by, or your little sister might have a gymnastics practice. That's what my daughter's doing right now, and so it's nice to know sort of at that time what issues you might have to deal with. And what warnings you might need to give your family members, maybe even your next door neighbor or your upstairs neighbor or whatever, to have a little peace and quiet from that magic time from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern on test day. So not just practice in the space, but consider doing it at the same time of day so that you might be able to eliminate any problems that might happen during the actual test.
Excellent. So you might be wondering why I'm not doing the full view presentation. That's because it actually hides the questions when I do that, but hopefully the links are there large enough for folks to read. And again, my final reminder was you can check out some more Going Virtual support at bfwpub.com/COVID-19. And of course, there's the HS Marketing email that you can email with questions after the fact. So I'll jump into some questions. I'll start with some early ones. So one that came in that I thought was good says, I have only taught my kids how to find p-values using TI-84 and not the tables. Do I need to give them a crash course?
Well, I'll go first, and then I'd be curious to hear what Daren and Luke have to say. Because they've told us that you're able to do all the calculations with paper and pencil, that would mean that they're not expecting you to use your TCDF function or your inverse norm function on your calculator. So whether or not they ask you to use tables to do that is kind of an open question. They've told us that students should have print out the formula sheet and the tables in advance. So that means they could use that. I'm just going to guess that I think it's unlikely that they would ask a question that would require a use of a table, knowing that many students don't use the tables and are used to using technology, and they want to kind of keep it fair for everyone. But that being said, if I would only taught calculators all year, I might spend 20 minutes at some point between now and then, just giving a quick overview of the table, just in case. That might make your students actually feel a little bit more comfortable if they print out these tables and like, why did I print this out? I have no idea how to use it. Maybe that would give them some comfort. So that's at least my thoughts. I'm curious to hear from the other two.
I would agree with you, Josh. I don't think that they're going to have them calculate test statistics is probably unlikely, and turning those test statistics into p-values, I think it's like more likely that they might have to interpret the p-value or use the p-value to make a conclusion to the significance test.
All right, I'll be the crotchety old man. What's wrong with tables? They were good enough when I learned AP statistics or whatever it was back in the 1900s. Okay, that's over now. No, I agree with my colleagues. My students have seen tables already, so that isn't going to surprise them that the tables are there or that they could use them. Have most of them used them this semester? I don't think so. I've converted over to 21st century, Mr. Starnes. So would I take time to do it? I would, just to make the students feel comfortable, but I wouldn't spend a long time.
Excellent. Then we got a bunch of other questions kind of related to that. And this one seems to kind of sum it up pretty well. It said, in your opinion, do you think it is better or more efficient to write out the answers on paper or just type it out on the computer? Some folks were concerned because not everyone knows how to type the formulas out on the computer or, you know, put the symbols through the keyboard. So any thoughts on that one?
I'll take this one, and we'll see if you both agree with me. But I think that you definitely want your students writing up solutions the way that they've been writing up solutions the entire year long, which is pencil and paper. That's what they're comfortable with. I really hate to think about kids trying to type in P1 hat minus P2 hat and put that all into the computer and figure that out. I think you want to go with what they're familiar with what they're comfortable with, and that's paper and pencil. You know, especially if they have to do any sort of drawing of a, you know, a normal distribution or some sort of display. I'm going to definitely tell my own students that they do pencil and paper like they have all year long.
Great. No, I think that answered it. We have Daren and Josh. Did you have anything to add to that, or?
No, other than they'll definitely want to use take advantage of the opportunity to practice with their devices. The downside that I can see with using paper and pencil is either you have to access the questions on your phone where you're going to be taking a picture of, or maybe like an iPad or something like that. And if it's on a phone, the screen might be a little small, might be a little frustrating or tedious to scroll back and forth to look at the question. Or you access the questions on a computer, have it on a nice big screen, but then you might have to take a picture with your phone and then send it to your computer and then upload it. And so that process is going to take an extra couple of minutes, depending on your bandwidth and all that. And one of the things they did say in the webinar is that if you're in a situation where you have a really slow internet connection, as long as you've pressed submit by the end of the 30 minutes or the end of the 20 minutes, depending on which question, the file doesn't have to be completely uploaded by the 30 minute, it just has to be submitted. And so if you submit your answer to question 1, you know, at minute 29, then it might take 5 minutes to upload, but it'll still open up question 2 on time and give you all the time you need for that. So I still, like Luke said, I would encourage my students to use, you know, do what they're comfortable with. And then, but then they need to practice with either system, either looking at the questions on their phone, which maybe the kids are going to be okay with. I've got old man eyes, so it's maybe harder for me. Kids hopefully will be all right with that.
Great. We kind of a related question to continue. I'm trying to go in chronological order as best I can. This might be a College Board question actually, but a bunch of people were asking it, so I figured maybe I could see if you all knew the answer. But many folks were wanting to confirm or know if students have to wait the full 25-30 minutes for the first question before moving to the second, or does it happen right away? I'm not sure if that might be again a College Board question, but I wasn't sure if you guys knew. Quite a lot of people asking about that.
So it's my understanding that that you can't finish a question early and then move on. So if you click upload at minute 25 or maybe even minute 20, if you hit submit, then you sit around and wait for 10 more minutes. And I think this has a lot to do with test security. For example, if say some kid didn't care about their score on the AP exam, but just wanted to see the questions and give some heads up to their friends, they could submit the question 1 after 1 minute, open up question 2, and then have 29 minutes to share that information with their friends before they have to see it. So I'm quite certain that everybody's question 2 will open at the same time, no matter when they submit question 1.
That makes sense. And definitely, yeah, a lot of worries with that. So that's probably what folks are asking. A couple other questions coming in. Some of these seem, so this was sort of, these were for you, Josh, I think. But one question was, in probability, you need to show your work. Can a student leave the answer as a fraction and still receive full credit without converting it to a decimal?
Yes, and that's always been the case. Say you're getting a probability from a two-way table or some other similar display. It's always been fine to show a fraction, even an unreduced fraction. So if the answer is 30 over 200, you get those numbers from the table, just leave it as 30 over 200, that's fine. You don't need to reduce it to 15 over 100 or 3 over 20. You don't need to write it as a decimal 0.15. That's always been the case, and I think would be especially true this year.
Cool. We had a general question come in about inference that I thought was pretty good. It said, just to ask your thoughts on it real quick, what are the advantages or disadvantages to teaching students the state, plan, do, conclude process for intervals and tests as opposed to the common acronyms PANIC and PHANTOMs?
I know, at least from my own experience with my students, they really like the fact that the state, plan, do, conclude is consistent from confidence intervals through significance tests. So it's not like they have a new acronym that they have to learn when they move over. And that consistency throughout, especially after the whole semester's worth of inference, students just generally feel super confident with state, plan, do, conclude. They know what goes where.
Great. And so again, I just want to tell everyone, because we had a ton of questions come in, if we didn't get to your question, look out for that extended question and answer document. And from that, on that document, we'll try to answer each question with a written response for you, or if we don't know the answer, we'll provide you where you can find the answer. While I look for a couple other good questions here for the remaining 7 minutes of the webinar, a bunch of shout outs, Luke, for your flamingo shirt, and some folks actually wondering why Josh and Daren don't have flamingo shirts on. So we might have to take care of that for the
college board shirt on here for reading.
Yeah. So I'm going to start.
I left mine in New Jersey.
Yeah. And I have to get one myself. So a lot of questions come in. So Luke, you gave some, here's a question I think is good. You gave some fabulous examples of some very common errors made by students in their use of language and symbols. Are there any others that come to mind?
I tried to grab the ones that we see often. That's why we put them in the webinar. Any help, Josh and Daren? Specific ones?
I'll take the one that comes to mind. Luke gave some examples of words that kids use as synonyms for bad. So a word that they often use as a synonym for good is accurate. So accurate has a specific meaning in statistics, meaning like unbiased or centered in the correct place. But a lot of times students will use it in place of precision. And so those words, kids will mess those up. So better to just describe what they're trying to say without using a key word like that if they're not certain that they're using it correctly.
Okay, great. A bunch of questions also coming in about Trevor's webinar last night, which I'm sure we'll be able to address in our extended Q&A. One of them was, Trevor mentioned a few times last night that the students will not be required to graph anything. So does that mean we shouldn't expect any questions where the students need to sketch a box plot, dot plot, etc.?
That was my understanding from what Trevor said. And I think that's, so what he said is like, they wouldn't be expected to draw any figures, graphs, that kind of thing. And this was an audience of also calculus teachers, as well as computer science. And I think the reasoning would be that if a student chooses to type their responses, then it would be really difficult to, like Luke was saying, sketch a normal curve or something like that. So there's going to be no required sketching of any kind of graph or diagram. Now, sometimes that helps. Like for my students, if they're asked to calculate a p-value or something, I still want them to sketch a little curve just to help them frame the question and make sure they're understanding what they're doing. Now, whether or not there's a normal distribution question is a different issue. But there'll be no graphs or figures required, according to the webinar last night.
Great. A couple other questions that we'll get in here. And again, apologies, my dog is barking in the background, if you guys can hear that. He's very excited about the online AP exam, it seems. But again, thank you again for everyone sending in questions. If we didn't get to them, we will get to them in the extended Q&A. One topic-specific question that came in: do you believe paired t-tests will be on the test? It's not in the CED, however, it has been on many of the reviews for the new exam.
So I'll jump in here. It actually is in the CED. Somebody asked me about this on an email last night. It's just not separated in the CED from one sample T procedures. So if you look at confidence interval for a mean, there's a parenthetical after whatever that learning objective is that says including differences within matched pairs. And the same thing for significance tests. Significance tests for a mean, including mean difference when you're dealing with paired data. So they are in there. It was a choice on the College Board's part to include it with one sample techniques, because it really is a one sample technique on the differences, on the paired differences. So it is there. Definitely don't skip it. It's something that students have struggled with before, trying to distinguish paired T procedures from two sample T procedures.
Excellent. Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. This is a nice general one, I think should be interesting. I'm not sure which one of you would like to answer first, but it says, what are some suggestions for practicing, quote, statistical thinking?
So one of the things I like that Josh said was not just like how to calculate things, but the why of things. So I think sometimes you can take a question that you may have used in class about calculating something or checking a condition specifically and turn it into a why question, especially with the conditions. Like, I think that there's a good chance that one of the conditions, it's not going to be about checking the condition. It's going to be about understanding why we check that condition. Which I like to call the so what of the conditions. So, we have a random sample. Great, we have a random sample. That's the condition. Why do we have a random sample? Well, so hopefully that it's representative of the population so that we can generalize to the population. So maybe you can think about taking some of the questions that we normally ask and turning them a little bit to ask students about like why it is that we do those things.
Let me add on to what Luke just said, and that is the examples he gave were nice because they span different parts of the curriculum, right? We check the random condition when we're doing inference, but why do we do that? Well, that goes back to collecting data. And why do we check the large counts condition? Well, that goes back to sampling distribution in that sort of probability world. And now the exam writers only have 2 questions to cover 7 units of this course. And so there's going to be questions that pull from different areas of the curriculum. And this is a good example, the whys and the hows of making those connections. And so I think if you can endeavor to try and point out the connections between the different areas of the course, and if kids can understand that, they've understood the full statistical process, then those questions about statistical thinking are going to be easier to deal with. Oh, and I thought of one other word that's a sort of a dangerous word to use, and that is the word independent. There's lots of different types of independence, and so kids will just, throw independent out there because they've seen it in a bunch of different places. But, depending on the context, they could be using it incorrectly. So I guess the main message is make sure you understand the word and all the different ways that we can deal with independence in our course. But if you're not confident that you're using it correctly, then don't use it.
The last thing I was going to say is that our students at Lawrenceville will definitely be working some problems that are created in the spirit of what Josh and Luke were just saying. Some good friends and colleagues on the AP Statistics teacher community have made some sort of practice questions. Josh and I debuted a few through a Texas Instruments webinar series over the last month. And so I know our kids are going to be working lots of questions like that over the next, 3 weeks or so, because we want them to be really dexterous at moving between the areas of the course, which is something that they struggle with on a normal year. Sorry for the use of the word normal. That was going to be my word. In a typical year, so we want to give them lots of practice being able to move between areas of the course within a question. We know that's what it's going to look like on the exam.
Awesome. Okay, so we're actually at time. So again, I just want to say, I know I keep repeating myself here, and apologies again for my dog barking. We did not get to all of the questions that were chatted in. I want to thank everyone that attended as well as chatted in a question. Know that in the next couple days, hopefully by the end of the week or early next week, we will send a follow-up. The follow-up email will include a recording of this webinar as well as the slides, and of course that extended Q&A doc where we will address all the unanswered questions that you can review later. Again, all the helpful links in the slide deck will be shared with you, so be sure to check them out. And again, finally, let me say thank you to our presenters tonight, Daren, Josh, and Luke. You guys are awesome. A lot of thank yous coming in from teachers. Really appreciative of you doing this for them. And I agree. So thank you so much for your time, and thank you everyone for attending. And with that, I wish everyone a good night and good luck on the AP exam. So take care, everyone.